I never thought a couple of garden gnomes could change the course of my life, but that's exactly what happened when my Homeowners Association, or HOA, decided that my tiny lawn decorations were a violation worth $20,000 in fines. It all started out pretty simply. I had just retired and moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood in Florida, hoping for peace, a little gardening, and some time to enjoy life. My wife loved flowers, and I loved a bit of humor. So I thought, adding a few gnomes to the garden would be a harmless way to bring some charm to the front yard. I placed 3 gnomes near our flower bed, each with their own tiny tools and hats, just standing cheerfully beneath the rosebush. The next day, I found a note taped to my front door. It was official looking with the HOA logo printed in bold, and it said I was in violation of aesthetic standards, and I had 72 hours to remove the lawn gnomes or face escalating fines. I laughed at first. I honestly thought it was a joke. Lawn gnomes, that's what they were worried about. I had seen cracked driveways, dead patches of grass, and one neighbor's house with a 15-foot inflatable flamingo in the backyard. Yet, somehow, my 3 6-inch gnomes were a crisis. But the HOA wasn't joking. A week later, I received another letter, this time stating that since I had failed to remove the gnomes, I now owed a fine of $500, and every day they stayed, the fine would increase. I was stunned. My neighbors shrugged it off. They're strict around here. One told me, just get rid of the gnomes, it's not worth the hassle. But that's exactly what got under my skin. It wasn't about the gnomes anymore. It was about control. The way this HOA treated us like children, enforcing rules that made no sense, with no room for discussion or logic. I tried calling the HOA board president. I left voicemails, sent emails, never got a single reply. So I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. I walked in holding one of the gnomes, like a lawyer holds a case file. I calmly explained that there was nothing offensive or dangerous about the gnomes, and that I simply wanted an exception, or, at least, a hearing. I was met with silence. One board member smirked. Another reminded me that decorative lawn figures were banned under the covenant. No explanation, no debate. They closed the topic and moved on. At this point, the fines had reached nearly $3,000. I thought about backing down, but something inside me said no. This isn't just about lawn ornaments anymore. This is about how people let authorities stomp on common sense. So I did something no one expected. I gave one of my gnomes a law degree. No, not a real one, of course, but I dressed him in a tiny black robe, gave him a mini diploma, and put a nameplate by his feet that said Counselor Norman J. Gnome-esque. I placed him right back in the yard. It was my way of fighting back with humor. The next morning, another fine arrived. Now they were charging me daily penalties plus a legal processing fee. I laughed. It was absurd. But I started documenting everything, letters, emails, photos, timestamps. I set up a camera facing the yard, 24/7, in case they tried anything shady. I even printed out the HOA bylaws and read them word for word. That's when I found something strange. The clause, banning decorative figures, was vague. It said excessive or distracting decorative displays were prohibited, but never defined what excessive meant, nor did it reference lawn gnomes directly. So I made a plan. If the HOA was going to go to war over interpretation, then I'd fight back on their terms. I contacted a local reporter I knew from my days as a city clerk. I shared the whole story, the gnomes, the fines, the refusal to hear me out. The reporter laughed and said, "You're kidding." I said, "Dead serious." A week later, the article hit the local news site. Man fined $20,000. Over lawn gnomes fights back with gnome attorney. Suddenly, the story went viral. People shared it across Facebook, Twitter, even Reddit. Comments poured in, most of them supporting me. Some even sent in their own photos of gnome armies in protest. Strangers mailed me mini briefcases, gavels, and tiny books titled Gnome Law 101. It was hilarious, but it also caught the HOA off guard. They had no idea what to do. Their office was flooded with emails and calls from people demanding to know why they hated gnomes so much. That's when they made their biggest mistake. They issued a cease and desist letter, addressed to Mr. Norman J. Gnome, Esquire. They tried to be sarcastic, but it backfired. I posted the letter online, and it only made the public laugh harder. Late-night talk shows picked it up. Memes exploded. My lawn gnome had become a legal celebrity. Behind the scenes, I was working with an actual lawyer. Not because I wanted to sue, but because I wanted to understand how deep the HOA's authority really went. What I learned was this. While HOAs do have power, they're not above state law. And in my case, they had misapplied their own bylaws and failed to follow due process when issuing repeated fines. It meant their entire case could collapse if challenged in court. But I didn't want a lawsuit. I wanted justice, and maybe a little fun along the way. So I scheduled a formal hearing and brought along Norman. I even gave him a little rolling briefcase and had him sit beside me at the hearing table. I wore a suit, not because I had to, but because I wanted to match my client. When the board saw the crowd of supporters outside, news cameras, protest signs, neighbors cheering, they looked pale. I calmly laid out my argument, referenced their own rules, and ended with this. If this HOA believes a gnome violates your values more than intimidation, then maybe it's not the gnome who needs to leave. The room was dead silent. The silence after I finished speaking at that hearing wasn't just awkward, it was uncomfortable. The kind where you know something inside the room just shifted. One board member finally broke it by saying, "We'll review and get back to you in writing." That was it. No discussion, no votes, just an official escape hatch. But I didn't leave quietly. I thanked them, shook hands, even thanked the security guard who had been assigned just in case. My little gnome, Norman, sat quietly by my side like a loyal attorney who knew he'd just delivered a knockout. The story outside that day was chaos. Reporters asking for interviews, supporters taking selfies with Norman, and kids giving him high fives like he was a superhero. My wife watched it all unfold from the porch with her tea, shaking her head in disbelief. We had only wanted a peaceful retirement. Now, we were somehow leading a miniature revolution. 2 days later, a letter arrived. I opened it slowly. My hands shook a little, even though I'd kept calm through everything else. It read, "Upon internal review, the board has decided to waive all previous fines and revise the section of the HOA agreement concerning decorative lawn figures. We encourage homeowners to submit requests for exceptions through the updated portal." Just like that, $20,000 in fines disappeared. No apology, no explanation. But it was a win. I should have been satisfied, and in a way, I was. But what struck me was how many neighbors started opening up after that. People who had never spoken to me before came by to say thanks. One woman said the HOA once fined her for hanging a bird feeder. Another man told me he was threatened with fines over the color of his mailbox flag. All small things. All treated like crimes. What had started as one man defending a gnome had turned into something bigger, a neighborhood waking up. That night, I sat outside with Norman on the porch, the real stars twinkling above, the plastic ones still guarding my flower beds. I looked at him and laughed. "You know, you started this, right?" My wife came out and said, "You should write a book about this." I told her, "I think we already lived one." But the story didn't end there. A week after the board dropped the fines, I received an invitation from a small legal podcast. They wanted to interview me, or more accurately, me and my gnome attorney. It was funny, sure, but the discussion turned serious pretty quickly. We talked about the unchecked power of HOAs, how many people feel intimidated by technical language and fear of retaliation. I shared what I had learned about reading bylaws, documenting everything, never accepting fines without proper review, and most importantly, standing up with reason and humor instead of rage. That podcast episode went viral. A lawyer in Texas messaged me afterward and said, "You just explained HOA law better than half the legal textbooks I've read." It was surreal. I started getting invited to speak homeowners forums, community meets, even a couple local council meetings. I never imagined I'd be doing this in retirement, but something about it felt right. And while all that was happening, the HOA wasn't quite done with me. At the next board election, 2 of the members I'd challenged quietly stepped down. Rumor had it that they'd received a flood of complaints from residents who finally found the courage to speak up. One neighbor even ran for the board, promising transparency and fairness. He won. Change had begun. Meanwhile, back at home, I didn't go overboard. I didn't line the whole yard with gnomes. I kept it tasteful. Norman stayed, of course, now sitting on a small brick pedestal with a plaque that read "Defender of the Lawn." My wife had the idea for the plaque. I loved it. We even got a letter from a small law school in Oregon asking if we'd donate Norman for display. I politely declined. Norman had earned his spot. But there was something even stranger that came next. A production company reached out. They said, "We saw your story, would you be open to a short documentary?" At first, I thought it was a scam, but it wasn't. They sent a crew. They interviewed me, my wife, some neighbors, and even filmed dramatic slow-motion shots of Norman against the sunrise. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My life had turned into something I never could have predicted, a story that started with frustration but ended with meaning. Through all of this, one thing kept repeating in my mind. The reason I didn't give up. It wasn't because I loved gnomes that much. It was because too many people had been made to feel powerless, to accept the absurd because it's easier. And the truth is, power doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just quietly places a robe on a garden gnome and lets him stand his ground. I remember getting a letter from a family in New York. They sent a picture of their daughter standing beside their new lawn gnome. She had dressed it in a tiny suit and called it Normina. The mom wrote, "Thanks for reminding us that humor can be power, too." And maybe that's what this was really about in the end. Not rebellion, not revenge, but restoring balance. Reminding everyone that rules should serve the people, not the other way around. That communities are built on conversation, not control. and that even the smallest figures in the garden or in society can stand tall when they stand for something. I wasn't a rebel. I was just a guy with a stubborn streak, a retired city clerk who believed in fairness and who happened to love a good joke. I never wanted fame or headlines. I just wanted to keep my gnome. But life, as always, had other plans. That's how I went from a fine-ridden homeowner to the accidental face of lawn justice. And all because of one silent little statue in a hat. Weeks passed. Things calmed down. No more letters in the mailbox. No more strangers taking pictures outside the fence. No board members knocking or warning me about code violations. The gnome drama faded, but its impact lingered. It was as if the neighborhood itself had loosened its collar. People seemed friendlier, more willing to speak, even joke. There was something oddly healing about all of it. One afternoon, I saw a family across the street setting up a lawn flamingo in sunglasses and a tiny detective badge. Their son waved to me and shouted, "Look, he's solving HOA crimes now." I laughed harder than I had in months. Norman had started something far bigger than either of us ever intended. Eventually, I was invited to a neighborhood panel about community rights and HOA reform. I hesitated at first. I wasn't a lawyer, and I didn't want to become the lawn gnome guy forever. But I realized people needed stories like mine, not just legal facts, but real experiences that showed you could fight back without losing your sanity. At the panel, I brought Norman with me. I sat him on the table like a co-host. People chuckled, but they listened. I explained how I researched the bylaws, kept written records, how I remained calm and respectful even when I was angry inside. I told them about the hearing, about how giving a gnome a law degree was both symbolic and strangely effective. It reminded people that you don't need a title to speak truth, just courage and patience. Someone from the audience asked, "Do you think HOAs should be abolished?" I paused. "No," I replied. "I think they should be reformed. There's nothing wrong with communities setting standards, but those standards should serve the people, not bully them. They shouldn't punish personality or creativity. They should support harmony, not demand uniformity." After the panel, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her HOA had threatened her with daily fines for having a wheelchair ramp in her front yard that didn't match the approved aesthetic. She'd been too afraid to speak up, assuming she was alone. I gave her a hug, told her she wasn't. It hit me then. This wasn't just about me or my gnome. It was about people everywhere quietly suffering under unreasonable rules. Afraid of retaliation, afraid of losing their homes or their peace. The power of my story wasn't in the absurdity of it. It was in how many people saw a piece of themselves in it. The documentary came out a month later. They titled it The Gnome Defender. It was short, only 20 minutes, but it went viral. National news picked it up. Late-night hosts joked about it. Even my old coworkers reached out to say they saw me on TV. At one point, I was trending on social media, something I never thought would happen to a retired man with a garden full of plastic statues, but through it all, I stayed grounded. My wife and I still spent evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip below the pine trees, sipping tea. Norman remained in his usual spot, now joined by a small cast of characters, a mini judge, a paralegal cat, even a dragon wearing bifocals, all gifts from strangers. Each one arrived with a story, a thank you, a reminder that laughter could unite, and a little resistance could restore balance. Months later, I was asked to help review new revisions to our HOA's bylaws. Me, the guy they once fined $20,000. I took the job seriously. I sat down with a group of residents, board members, and legal consultants. We went line by line. We removed the most absurd restrictions. We added protections for accessibility, personal expression, and fair appeals. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For once, we were building something instead of fighting over it. Looking back now, I realize how important small acts of defiance can be. How standing up for something silly like a lawn gnome can spark real change. Not every battle is about politics or money. Some are about respect, dignity, being able to decorate your own yard without feeling like a criminal. People ask me now what they should do if their HOA gives them trouble. I always say the same thing. First, read the rules. Really read them. Know what they can and can't do. Second, document everything. Every letter, every photo, every notice. Third, stay calm. Don't scream, don't insult. Just show up with your facts, and if humor helps, use it. A well-dressed gnome in a graduation cap said more than 1,000 angry words ever could. And finally, know that you're not alone. There are thousands of people just like you. Honest, ordinary folks who want a little peace and a little space to make their homes feel like their own. The moment we stop letting fear control us, we take back that space. I still get mail about Norman. People send updates about their own legal garden creatures. One guy in California said he took a photo of Norman to his HOA hearing and won his case. A woman in Ohio painted her gnome in Supreme Court robes. I even got a message from a real lawyer who said, Thanks for the inspiration. Sometimes we forget the law is supposed to serve people, not intimidate them. It's funny how life works. I thought I was just an old man being stubborn about a statue. But somewhere along the way, that stubbornness became a statement. That gnome, motionless, silent, spoke volumes. And the world listened. So now, every time I step out into my yard and see Norman standing there, I smile. Not because I won, but because I didn't let them steal the joy out of something harmless. I didn't let fear win. I defended a piece of myself and in doing so, helped others do the same. And maybe, just maybe, the world is a little better for it.